The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People with Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal is the show we have for you today. Taryn is the founder and chief resilience officer of the Resilience Leadership Institute, and she is recognized as an international expert on resilience, mental health, and well-being. She joins us today to discuss her book, The 5 Practices of Resilient People: Why Some Flourish While Others Fold. In this episode, we discuss how we recognize our self-worth, the power of connection, how we are both a masterpiece and a work in progress, and so much more. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Taryn, welcome for joining me on The Growth Guide. Before we dive into the 5 practices of highly resilient people, would you be able to give the listeners a brief bio about yourself so we can get to know you before we talk about your book?
Oh, that's so kind of you to give me an opportunity to introduce myself. I would say, so I bet people say like all of the really smart things about themselves in their bio. So let me start with a couple of things that your listeners, our listeners today, may not know. One is I have 2 learning disabilities. I am both dyslexic and I have ADHD. As a result of an experience that I had, or a series of experiences that I had in high school that were highly traumatic, which we may talk about today, or we may not, I also developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm a survivor of 2 decades of post-traumatic stress disorder. And on top of that, I managed to get my doctorate degree, even though I was diagnosed with my learning disabilities at age 37 in neuropsychology. And I also have a master's in marriage and family therapy. And all the while I was leading global leadership development at Cigna and executive leadership development and talent strategy at Nike, looking after our top 400 vice presidents in our C-suite, I also wanted to know how we as humans effectively face challenge, because as we do, I had had my fair share, as we all have. And that led to publishing my most recent book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People: Why Some Flourish and Others Fold.
Wow, incredible. It's going to be fun talking through this with you, and that makes both of us who were diagnosed with ADHD as adults. So for our listeners, it doesn't have to hold you back. I like to think of it as a superpower, but we'll talk about that at another time. Let's dive into the book. And where I'd love to start with you is this idea that I heard early on in COVID, and it was that isolation equals amplification. And it tied to your writing, which indicated that through COVID, our experience of negative emotions climbed. But you also had the caveat that it had already been climbing for a decade. So can you walk us through what was leading to that negative emotions and increasing over the last 10 years? And how did it hit us all so hard during COVID?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows for sure. The what is that negative emotions is a tough one, because this is how Gallup talks about it. Negative emotions, I don't know that I necessarily like to classify emotions as being negative or positive. All of our emotions are information. They're meant to teach us, they're meant to guide us. And I think so often what happens in our society here in North America is that there's a range of emotions that are okay for us to emote, if you will. And other things like anger, frustration, disappointment, feeling disconcerted, depression, anxiety. In some circles, in many circles, it doesn't feel sort of safe to share those emotions. So I'm hesitant to categorize emotions as negative, but I think what we saw empirically that has been happening over the last decade prior to COVID is that we were already experiencing what I'll call an amplification of concerns around mental health and well-being. people were not feeling as satisfied with their lives. People were not feeling as excited about the possibilities. People were feeling more concerned about what was happening economically relative to the climate and environment here in the United States, in particular, to gun control. And so, I don't think we know for sure, just exactly what people have been, responding to. But I think more and more over the last decade, people were already feeling less at ease and less in a good mental space. And then COVID showed up and it isolated us from each other. And for some people, for many of us, there were tremendous insights. There were tremendous aha moments. There were big pivots in terms of how people thought about their career and their contributions and what they wanted to do with this one wild and precious life. And I think there was the sense that we were going to get out of quarantine and all just be so excited to be together again. And I think what we see empirically and anecdotally is that that's actually not the case right now. People seem to have a shorter fuse, to be angrier, to be even further, not at ease, give others, less of the benefit of the doubt, assuming less positive intent. And I think we've all been through a bit of the ringer. And what I like to say is, our ability to like and love others is often limited by our ability to love and like ourselves. And I think there's a lot of folks who aren't feeling great about themselves right now, and therefore aren't able to offer that sense of grace and connection because so many of us are grappling with what's happening internally.
It feels like what we've done is go through one of the greatest social experiments. Well, maybe not the greatest, one of the worst social experiments will ever have come through. And if there's ever a time that we need to understand resilience, and to your point earlier, talking about PTSD, there's a certain baseline level of almost feeling is if a lot of humanity has gone through that over the last 3 years while being isolated for long periods of time. And you mentioned we thought it would be over and then we'd be able to get back to people. And part of what we saw is that yo-yo of unknowing. It's going to open back up. We're locked down again. We're allowed out again. Now we're locked up again. And no one really had, uh, I'd say, an end in sight, if that makes sense. Do you think that contributes, that uncertainty almost contributed to what we're seeing, to your point, an increasing lack of civility and kindness in people?
Yes, 1600% did the lack of predictability and sense of control over our environment, has that impacted our mental health, even today, right? We will continue to see what I'll call rebound effects from all of this for many years to come. The problem with control over our lives is not that we've lost it. It's that we've come face to face with the inconvenient truth that we never had it in the first place. And that's a very different perspective. For many of us, we got in our car, we drove to work, we took care of our children, and we felt that we were able to plan and to a large extent control our lives and what happened to us. And that, yes, sometimes bad things happen to good people, but by and large, we knew the turns we were going to take in our lives and the shape of what our experience was going to look like. And, I think COVID is one of those things that has just taken our sense of sustainability and predictability and put it in a blender. And then since then, we continue, I think, to get rocked by aftershocks of unpredictability and insustainability. We have, the war in Ukraine, continued gun violence, concerns about, the global economic picture here in the United States, potentially, a recession, which we may not be aware of for at least, one more quarter, looking back at 2 quarters of negative growth. So there's so many factors just when we wanted to sort of get our cars back on the road of our lives and put it on cruise control or get in the HOV lane. It just seems like there's sort of car crash after car crash. And the strategies and the tools that we had to deal with these things, I think we're finding they either don't work anymore or they don't work to the extent that they once did. And I think that's incredibly disconcerting for people as well.
In the pace that these things are happening is magnified. So in the past, you might go decades without getting rocked by one of these things. And now it feels like every 6 months or every 3 months or every month with social media, with the news, we're seeing everything as it happens live. And one of the ones that's jumping out for a lot of people is AI. Is it going to replace my job? So I'm already worried about a recession. Now people are telling me ChatGPT is going to replace my job. There's a lot of fear there, which makes resilience super important. And I thought one of the things you talked about that I'd love to tackle is this idea that when we learn new skills, they're additive. But when we have resilience, it's a multiplier. Why is resilience so powerful to use those words as a multiplier instead of just additive to our already existing toolkit?
I love this question so much because, first and foremost, one of the ways that I've wanted to shift the script on how we talk about resilience is to say that resilience is not something we go out and find or cultivate or, sort of fetch and bring back to ourselves. Because so many people, when we enter this conversation about resilience, there's what I call the resilience dread factor. And it's the sense of like, okay, resilience, that sounds nice, but am I going to be found wanting or lacking? Am I going to be sort of one of these people who doesn't have enough resilience, quote unquote? And so it can be scary to look under the hood. And in fact, what I've found is that resilience is actually the essence of being human. It is fundamentally connected to who we are as human beings. And so there's nobody out there who is ever going to be in lack relative to resilience. And that is such an important and reassuring point for people to understand. The second thing is that challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 Cs, this is the fabric of what it means to be human. We can't engineer challenge, change, and complexity out of our lives. And in fact, we actually don't want to, because these are the moments where we have the greatest opportunity to amplify and enhance our resilience. And so when we think about resilience being a multiplier, resilience isn't just about going out and getting some kind of skill or tool. It's actually about looking within us to see the talents and the strengths and the goodness that already existed within us as a person, and then being able to bring those out and amplify them, to a greater degree. And just to briefly, underscore this point, there's this word in the English language that's silience, right? Silience is the word in the English language. And silience means to uncover our hidden talents, to find the strengths within. And I think every single one of us has been in a moment of challenge where we're like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Like, kind of just want to fold up my tent and go home. Like there is no roadmap, there is no blueprint. And yet looking back, we're like, oh my gosh, I made it through that thing, right? And every single one of us has made it through every single disappointment, loss, pandemic, crisis, rejection, frightening turn of events. And we're all here. And we all, in some weird way, have become better for it. Why? Because we were able to reach in deep with silience and find things within us that we actually didn't know we were there. So if silience is about finding our talents, resilience or that moment of challenge is about finding a reminding or giving us an opportunity to dig in there. And that's what makes it a multiplier, because it's not just this one kind of additive thing. It's about going within and truly knowing ourselves and being able to identify holistically how we are deeply equipped to be able to face challenge.
And when you talked about the three C's, challenge, complexity, and change, is there any one of the three that really jumps out at you as the stickiest for people or the one that they find the hardest?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I talk about the three C's is a lot of times they go hand in hand, right? So if we think about change, oftentimes people are very challenged by change. And oftentimes the advent of change brings about a feeling of complexity, right? And when we experience complexity, that can feel very challenging. And sometimes, in order to adapt to the complexity, we need to harness change, right? So for me, the lines were sort of blurry between all three of them. And I think oftentimes they show up in concert with one another. Although I think for certain people in certain moments, we say humans aren't good at change, but, we're also not great at moments of challenge or moments of complexity either.
Yeah, the one that stood out for me was definitely change, and part of it is the reverse of a C, but certainty versus uncertainty. And a lot of people seem to love certainty in their life. And when you introduce change, you're introducing that uncertainty. And especially you'll see this in the workplace, is when you have something that's changed and you need something done quickly and there wasn't enough notice. A lot of people can get thrown by that because it was, well, I came in today. These were the five things I was going to do. Now you've asked me to do something else. I'm frazzled. I don't know how to introduce that change or uncertainty into my routine.
Yeah, we love predictability.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
And
Yes.
it goes along with that sense of control, and what we're finding in younger generations, I actually write about this in my book, is actually younger generations are less and less equipped to deal with a corollary, to this idea of uncertainty, which is ambiguity. And so as parents, oftentimes, even though we can't engineer the three C's out of our lives, we often, with very good intentions, try to engineer them out of our children's lives. And when we engineer challenge, change, and complexity out of our children's lives, we don't give them an opportunity to be in those moments of uncertainty. We don't give them an opportunity to be in those moments of ambiguity. And so then as they grow up into, kind of young adults and, are entering the workforce, all of a sudden, right, there's this ambiguity of like, will I get the promotion or not? You know, there is no template for a thing. They've got to come up with the structure. They've got to be the ones, or they get to be the ones to be the translator of sort of, clarity to chaos. And that's really tough for people if they haven't had opportunities to practice that. So as parents, I think one of the things that we get to do is to introduce age appropriate, and titrated kind of ambiguity and uncertainty into our children's lives and to shepherd them through the process of navigating. So whether that's, trying out for a team and say, well, like, honey, I don't know if you're going to make it either. Let's give it your best. Let's practice together. And then we're going to see what happens. Or like in my case, one of the things that I've written about is with my younger son, he was waitlisted for kindergarten at the school where his older brother goes to school. And he worked his way up to the top of the wait list over the course of the summer. So he was number one on the wait list, going into the fall. And I had asked the office of the school if it would be all right to bring him to the, kind of pre-fall kindergarten roundup meeting with all of the other kindergartners and teachers. And they sort of shuddered and they said, why would you want to do that? What if he doesn't get in? And I said, we've had a talk with him and we've said he's number one on the wait list and there's a good chance that he'll get in. There's also a chance that he won't get in. And in that case, he's going to go to this, to this other school. But that was a great moment in his life where we got to, in an age appropriate way, help him sit with what it felt like to be in a moment of ambiguity. Where was he going to be going to kindergarten in the fall? And to help him learn to navigate that moment rather than just trying to, streamline that and make his path clear.
And almost shelter them from the potential of failure. recognizing that really, to your point earlier, it's when we go through these challenges, it's when we fail that we can come out the other side and be stronger for it. And so letting our kids be in that position where they may fail may actually benefit them in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I love the question. I would decouple the idea of facing ambiguity and uncertainty from failure, because I think in the midst of the potential for failure and the potential for success for that matter, certainly there are moments, many moments of ambiguity and uncertainty. And yet I think the idea of, placing our children in the way of age appropriate ambiguity and uncertainty is a different phenomenon, than failure. What I will say about failure is I've thought a lot about this, and I'm not one of these people who's like, there's no such thing as failure, right? Like there is failure. It does exist. I don't think it exists at the rate or the level that we believe it does. People will talk about a failed marriage. I'm like, but did it? But did your marriage fail? I mean, you didn't stay married, but is that a failure? Or is that a lesson and an invitation to know yourself more deeply, for your partner to know themselves more deeply, to co-parent together, to effectively, lead two households? I think the vast majority of things that we call failure are things that we turn out differently than we thought and end up being tremendous life lessons. And so, when I worked at Cigna and Nike, my team, would come to me and they'd say, "Oh, we've made a mistake," right? And I'd say, "Hold on. Have we made this mistake before?" And they would say, "Well, no, we haven't." And I'd say, "Then in that case, it's not a mistake. The first time, it's a lesson.
Yeah.
When we don't learn from the lesson and it comes around again, then I think we start to make a mistake." But I remember growing up, I'll say another thing about failure. I remember growing up, like one of the things my parents like to say a lot is like, "You'll ruin your life." Is this very sort of catastrophic thinking. If you go to that party and you're there and other kids are drinking and you get caught and then they'll arrest you and then they'll throw you in the slammer and you'll ruin your life, right? And something that I've gotten to think about, recently is like, can we really ruin our lives? Like, can we? We can ruin relationships and we can ruin jobs and we can ruin opportunities and we can ruin moments. I think it's really, really hard to ruin our lives. The vast majority of people that I have spoken to about the challenges that they have faced have essentially talked about, you know, facing a challenge that, either was completely outside of their control, or maybe there was an element of, somehow they made some decisions that, invited or brought that challenge into their lives. And almost everybody speaks about that experience, hindsight being 2020, looking back with a sense of gratitude for what happened, right? Not that they would do it again, not that they thought that that was a good choice, but this sense of they can see the good in those circumstances and they can appreciate what came out of those moments that fundamentally and forever changed them and made them who they are today.
Yeah, and what I often find and write about frequently is generally it's only in the darkness that we can find the light. And so often, bigger the failure, if you will, the bigger the lesson, the bigger the feedback. And then if we're willing to listen to it and say, how can I be improved by what I've been through? Those are the messages that really take us to the next level. And there's a certain what we're talking about today. There's a certain resilience in that to be able to be hit by those hard experiences and say, I'm going to come out the other side of this better for having gone through it. And so, as we talk about that resilience, you suggest there are 5 practices of highly resilient people. We say vulnerability, productive perseverance, connection, grandiosity, and possibility. Do you want to share what these are at a high level? And then we'll dive into a few details of each of them. And then our listeners can grab the book to learn more.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's do it. So, over the course of the past 2 decades, I have interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data and asked people about a challenge they faced and how it was looking back that they believed they had effectively faced that challenge. And I first wanted to understand this because I wanted to know, like, is there sort of common ground or common thread between us, certain things that we all do or could do that would be the roadmap to facing, challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's, in a more effective way to create a more positive and productive outcome. And so it turns out there is a common thread, and those common threads are the 5 practices of highly resilient people. And I got really excited about that because every time I have faced a challenge, and many people that I know face challenges, we're literally or figuratively saying to ourselves, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Right? And so the 5 practices of highly resilient people is really that blueprint, those things that people do in those moments that they told me that created a more positive and productive outcome. And so the first practice, to your point, Clint, is the practice of vulnerability. Now, when vulnerability showed up with all of my, qualitative research and interviews, I was both surprised, as many people are, and personally convicted because I had been living a life that was profoundly invulnerable and basically loving it, by the way. I went through a series of experiences in high school where I had a stalker, and that stalker behavior progressively escalated. And he ultimately, after I went to college, ended up assaulting and raping a woman in our neighborhood. And he went to prison for 20 years. And I too spent time in captivity. I developed PTSD for 2 decades. And I alluded to that in my introduction. And so as someone who had felt incredibly vulnerable in those, formative childhood years between 14 and 18, I had resolved that I was going to make myself invulnerable. I was, as a lot of people who experience trauma do, I was very focused on perfectionism, on getting good grades, on being the best at everything, and just, a thick coat of lacquer around like any, potential flaw. And I talk a lot in my book about how sort of at the same time I was uncovering this in my research, I got feedback on my annual review, and it was like, everything's good except you're not vulnerable enough. And I was like, excuse me? Like, you want me to be vulnerable? Like, I thought like perfection was the game here. So anyway, vulnerability is actually tremendously powerful when it comes to resilience. And that surprises a lot of people, including me initially. Vulnerability is probably not well understood. And a lot of people think that vulnerability is like discrediting ourselves, being self-deprecating, being completely transparent, letting it all sort of hang out, if you will. And vulnerability is actually none of those things. Vulnerability is allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experience to, as closely as possible, match the outside self that we're sharing with the world. And when we do that, we're in congruence with ourselves, or in sort of the greatest congruence possible. And then vulnerability becomes tremendously powerful in those kind of big 3C moments, because when we allow people to see what we're going through, we get more support, more information, more knowledge, right? People come alongside us in those moments. And we're not attempting to run what I call 2 human operating systems, which is to be feeling and experiencing something on the inside, but yet pretending on the outside that everything's okay. So just in the moment when we need, all of that kind of human capital energy to create more congruence between the inside self and the outside self. And this, vulnerability is the foundation that allows us to effectively address challenge.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me. And when you talk about vulnerability in that way, you distinguish between the idea of performance vulnerability versus genuine vulnerability, which seems to be when we're in congruence. What then does performance vulnerability look like? And how is that actually a negative impact for us in our lives and especially in our careers?
Yeah. I was meeting with a dear friend and colleague, Michael Bungay Stanier, and he and I were talking about this idea of vulnerability. And as a result of that conversation that we were having, he was a guest on my podcast. I was inspired to not only define vulnerability and what gets in the way of vulnerability, but to actually look at where are the places in our lives where we might be thinking that we're vulnerable, that, we're sort of not in the truest sense. And what are the places in our life where we are demonstrating, to your point, that sense of genuine vulnerability? And so I write about this in the book, where even when we're allowing our inside self to match the outside self that we're sharing with the world, performative vulnerability is not a great kind of vulnerability, because what we're doing with performative vulnerability is it can be attention seeking, it can be reputation management, it can be, I want you to feel sorry for me, I want you to feel great about me. So now I'm sort of manipulating, right, this interaction that we're having to tell you things, to have you feel and think, certain things about me. And that's performative, vulnerability. Think of, maybe like some reality television shows, that you've
Yeah,
seen,
exactly.
where, performative vulnerability is alive and well. Genuine vulnerability is always about engendering a genuine human connection between us, right? So I tell you the story about my dyslexia. I tell you, not the story, but I tell you about the diagnosis of my dyslexia. I tell you about the diagnosis of my ADHD. I tell you about experiencing, PTSD, not to sort of like let it all hang out there, but to create a genuine connection between me and you, and between me and your listeners. Because if I come on and say like, oh, I've got a PhD in this thing, and, I've been an executive here, here, and here, like, that's good. I'm creating a sense of, social proof and credibility, but it also in some ways creates distance, because people are thinking, well, how am I going to be able to relate to this person if I
Yes,
haven't
yes.
accomplished those things? Like, that's so nice, lady, that you have studied resilience, but like, help me understand like any kind of hardships that you've gone through in real life. And so just that way that I wanted to share my introduction with you was a bid at genuine vulnerability around sharing things about my life and about my experience that I'm hopeful will create a more genuine connection between you and I and our listeners.
And when you talk about that use of here are some of my challenges and in my failings, I often tell people who are creators, those are the glue that will bind your audience to you. Now, there's an important thing I've read, and if you wrote this, I'd be even happier. Is this idea that that specifically works when you've already established competence. So you've said to us, I have a PhD in this, and here are some challenges that I have. There's that issue of if you haven't established the competence first, and then we talk about our challenges, the audience may just think, well, they're incompetent. And I'm forgetting the name of the principle where establish competence and then be willing to share the vulnerability. And that's what really brings the audience or attaches the audience to you. Is that resonating with you?
It absolutely is. I'll give an example that came out of my executive coaching and my work in the corporate world, where I was coaching an executive leader who was very high potential in her organization. And as we do with people that are high potential individuals, we often give them cross functional promotions, like, pull them out of, the vertical that they're in and put them in another place in the organization to learn the business to a greater degree. And what this does is it also, very much, can put our high potential people at risk. And so she was moving out of the marketing department and she was going to head up a team inside of operations. And so during our executive coaching, I was talking with her about her first team meeting and how she was going to go about introducing herself, to her team. She was very nervous about it. And she said, I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to tell them, that I don't know what I'm doing. And I've spent my career in marketing and I don't know anything about operations. And, it's, don't count on her to know the answers to any hard questions or, things like this. Right. And I stopped and I said, okay, what do you think you're doing there? And she said, well, I'm being vulnerable. And I said, I don't think you are. I think you're discrediting yourself. To your point, Clint, there is a level, I think, especially in new relationships, about leading with a sense of competence and confidence. And once we've sort of established that level of credibility, to then also lead with a sense of vulnerability and genuine vulnerability that is meant to engender deeper human connection. But to your point, if we just simply lead with our fears and, if there is, a clear and present failing or things that have gone well in our lives, people start to question, why is this person a guest on your podcast? Why are they at the helm of this organization? Right. So being able to strike that balance.
And when you first decided to share your vulnerability and personal story of PTSD, which you've shared with us, and the stalker situation you dealt with growing up on stage, hugely vulnerable moment for you. What were some of the lessons that you took away from that situation?
Yeah. So in that situation, what I'm about to say next is a little bit more, what's the word? A little bit more dramatic. What I'm about to say is a little bit more dramatic than it was really, right? You sort of think about the researcher who's come up with a serum or something that they think is going to enhance our bodies, and they believe in it so much, and they also don't want to put anyone at risk, that they sort of like inject it into themselves first, so that's what was happening here. This moment was me becoming my own case study, because what had happened in the realm of vulnerability is I had also uncovered this concept called the vulnerability bias. Because I got to thinking, okay, if we know vulnerability is good for us, if we know it creates genuine connection, if Brene Brown says so and that it amplifies, living a wholehearted life, why aren't we all running around living our most fabulous,
Yes.
vulnerable lives, right? Like, what's the difference between the knowing and the doing? And it turns out the difference between the knowing that vulnerability is good for us and the doing of it is there's a fear, and there's something that I've called the vulnerability bias, which appears to be sort of a hardwired kind of cognition that we have, maybe, left over from an evolutionary perspective, where we really needed to rely on other humans to physically stay together, like in a pack, in order to survive. So it was like, don't be different, don't be weird, just, stay together and be like everybody else. And so now, right, the tables have turned. We're not reliant on one another necessarily physically to survive. We are now more reliant on our connections to survive, in terms of wellness, in terms of mental health, in terms of having that important human connection, empathy, authenticity. And we know that vulnerability drives that. But oftentimes, for the vast majority of us, when we think about sharing something that's vulnerable, that feels vulnerable to us, the vulnerability bias is a voice in our heads that says, don't do that. That's a very bad idea. In fact, if you do that, Taryn, if you do that, Clint, the 3 L's will occur. People won't like you, they won't love you, and they might leave. And that is a powerful prohibition for us to stay what I call locked in our vulnerability cage. So here I was with this, capital R resilient story, PTSD, 2 decades of trauma, rising executive, inside of my, Fortune 50 corporation. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to become my own case study. I'm going to get up on stage and I'm going to tell this story. And one of two things are going to happen. I'm going to prove the vulnerability bias wrong, and telling the story is going to create more connection with people. Or I'm going to get up on stage and realize like the vulnerability bias is right. And I shouldn't instruct people to be vulnerable. So I got up on stage and, of course, talked about my research, talked about the practices. And then I told, this story of the stalker and of the PTSD that was incredibly vulnerable for me. And one thing that I did that I think is really important, for people when you do this is we also just sort of can't leave that hanging. It's like we're taking people on a journey. And so, by the way, I don't recommend telling your most vulnerable stories on stage, especially as like an initial, it's not recommended, right? So, but I talked to enough people about it and I'd done my own work and I'd gone to therapy and, so I got up on stage and what I did is I connected this story with, right, how these experiences had formed me into the person that I was today. So having had experienced tremendous, fear and anxiety, I could now work inside of a corporate world as an executive coach, as someone who's developing leaders and help them face the things that were profoundly frightening to them, right? Because whether, whether we're deriving fear from a shark in the water or a new product launch, right? It all feels the same to us, right? And so I talked about how having faced my own fears and worked through these difficult times actually equipped me to be very centered in moments where I was working with other people on their fears, on their insecurities, on their vulnerabilities. And I think that tie is really important. But that was the moment where I, sort of drank my own Kool-Aid and became my own case study. And sure enough, not only did it create, greater connection, it was one of the things, early on that really expanded and amplified my career and my speaking career. And I was getting invitations from, all over to come and talk about resilience and also inside of my own company.
Oh, beautiful. And with your career and the growth you were going through, productive perseverance seems like something you would have been embodying on overdrive. And for our listeners who don't know it, you talk about three common qualities that embody a resilient mindset as part of it: a clear desire, a defined purpose, and a dogged determination. What are those and how do they drive the power of productive perseverance?
Yeah, I think that mindset is really important and it mirrors what came up for me in my research really mirrors, what I've seen in other books as well. Even things as classic as like, Napoleon Hill's Laws of Success, right? And so the first part is about having a desire, recognizing that there is a desire in us to do something or be something or become something. We see something out there in the world and we say like, I want to have that, right? So that is, a clear desire, right? Then it's about making that part of our purpose. Why do I want to have that? How do I want to enhance humanity? How can I be of service through this desire and through that desire manifesting itself inside of that purpose? And then the dogged determination is just, a willingness to really not give up. And it's interesting to sort of position that alongside what productive perseverance means, but I'll just give you an example. So I'm out in Las Vegas this week, really for, kind of two reasons. It lined up that my boyfriend was going to be playing in the World Series of Poker out here in Las Vegas, right? And I, at the same time, was doing an executive retreat for a corporation, a keynote speech for the same company, and also doing an in-person podcast recording in the same week. So we were leaving a little bit earlier than we would need to for him to get here in time to enter into the World Series of Poker. And we ran into, all of these kind of seeming barriers, right? First, it was like, we had issues getting the pets boarded. Then we ran into a bunch of traffic. Then we missed our first flight because we couldn't get there in time to check bags. All these things happened. So we were going back for our second flight. And, my boyfriend said to me, well, if this doesn't work out, it just wasn't meant to be. And I said, or it's the universe asking us how much we want it. And I think so often when things happen in our lives, we have the opportunity to choose what the interpretation is going to be of that moment. And, he wanted to come, he wanted to play, he'd done the work, he'd gotten the cash, to be able to stake himself. And, it's this idea of dogged determination. Oftentimes we'll see, signs, right, of things, and we'll make sense of that. But those signs are actually many times neutral. They could mean one thing or another. Traffic could mean, in a missed flight could mean we're not meant to be there, or it's how much do you want it? ? Show me, right? And so I think the dogged determination is about unwillingness and unstoppableness when we truly want something to not give up. And, if the front door is closed and locked, to go around to the back door, to try the windows, to keep going until we're able, to find that thing that we want. And so productive perseverance is related to that in the sense that the most resilient people that I interviewed talked about the art and the science of pursuing a goal, a willingness to persevere amidst or in the face of challenge, and also an understanding of when that pursuit might start to have diminishing returns and how they might pivot, large or small, in a new direction.
And so what was the ending result for him?
So we got here. We got to the World Series of Poker, and he played, he got the money. He didn't make the final day or the final table, but then he ended up in another tournament today, which is a one day tournament. And it's called a bounty tournament, which I'm just learning all these poker terms.
Yeah.
Where there's a bounty on each person's head. And so for each person you knock out, there's a certain bounty that comes along with that, in addition to making the final table. And when I last spoke to him, he was the chip leader, at his table. And I think now we're 3 hours from the tournament culminating, right? So, I think this productive perseverance is about continuing to persevere in the face of challenge, and also an openness to how our goals and how our greatest desires actually end up unfolding and manifesting in our lives.
Yeah, there were 3 things that jumped out at me when I was reading about the productive perseverance, and those were the importance of staying power, preparing for the pivot, and ultimately, this is the hard one: when do we surrender?
Right.
What do those look like?
Yeah. I remember listening to this meditation by Deepak Chopra one time. And he talked about meditating, focusing on what we wanted to create in the world. Another person who I like and appreciate his teachings a great deal, Joe Dispenza, talks about experiencing a sense of gratitude when we meditate, to envision ourselves having the things that we want, and to not get up from that meditation until we have seen clearly what we want to create and become, and expressed a sense of gratitude, because gratitude is the signature for, it is done, right? It has already happened. And now we just kind of wait for time to catch up with, our imagined future, of course, all along the way, doing the work. And one of the things that Deepak Chopra said when he talked about envisioning what we are trying to create, what we most desire, is I kind of think about it, as a college application, right? So, when I applied to college, it's a little different today, because I think I hand wrote my applications and we sent them through the mail, and, now you do them online and send them right away. But it was I did as much as I could in my formal schooling and worked on those applications, and then I sent them off. I sent them off to the universities that I hoped, or the colleges that I hoped to attend. And then it was out of my hands, right? Maybe they chose me. Maybe they didn't. Maybe I was waitlisted. And I think creating things in our lives is a lot like that. It's about really doing the work. It's about being very focused. It's about being very intentional. And then sending that off, into the world, sending that application off for what we want to create. And then, the universe, God, however you think about that, will let us know what the determination is, what we'll hear back. And I remember Deepak Chopra said, sending it out into the world and letting the universe work out the particulars. And so I think that's a really beautiful intersection that we can all be in this moment of recognizing that the problem with control is that we never had it in the first place. And so recognizing what is within our control, what is within our sphere of influence, and then being able to release and relinquish the things that are not, and allowing the rhythm and the flow and the universe, depending on, how you and others think about that, to work out the particulars and, to see what happens with those applications that we're sending out into the world for the life we want to create.
When you say it that way, it really reminds me of the serenity prayer and recognizing what we can control and what we can't, and the ability to know the difference between the two is beautiful. If we switch to the third practice, connection, what really stood out for me was this idea that you talked about, which was separating the idea of internal connection and external connection. Because generally, when we think of connection, we almost always talk about external. We rarely talk about internal connection. And you use this powerful concept of I am. What does that look like for people? And can you take us through that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. So connection, to your point, Clint, is so often about our connections with other people. And yet, first and foremost, connection is about connection with ourselves. It's about the person that's living within this skin. It's about our willingness to know and to like and to deeply love and appreciate the person that we are. And I think so few of us do that. So few of us really take the time to deeply know and love and like ourselves, because that can feel really scary. It can feel really scary to know this person within our skin. And so often it feels a lot easier to know and like and love other people rather than ourselves. And yet one of the things that I tell people is that our ability to like and to love other people is limited only by our ability to like and love ourselves. And people say, yes, but it's so much easier to like and love other people. And I say, yes.
Yeah.
Until they do something wrong, and then it isn't.
As you say that, it reminds me of loving kindness meditation. And we'll often tell people, we're going to start this by you picturing someone that it's easy to love. And let's wish that person loving kindness. Now we want to focus on you. We want to focus on ourselves, but it may be challenging for you. And if it is, picture that person wishing you loving kindness as a way to ease into it. It's that ability to, we're okay with saying, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be loved to someone that we care about. But it's so hard for us to say, may I be well, may I be safe, may I be loved. Why is that so hard for us to do?
I mean, I was going to ask you the same question.
Okay.
Do you have a perspective on this?
I think in general, and it may be different for everybody. For some people, that may be a very easy answer. For other people, what jumps out at me as you ask it is I'll look at myself. I'll use myself. I always like to speak from lived experience. It's very easy for me to have high self-confidence, and partially because I demonstrate probably the 5 principles of highly resilient people. I've done a lot of hard things in life and been successful, and I know I can achieve things. That's easy. What I have almost none of is self-regard. And so I can do these hard things, but I will almost never say, hey, great job for doing this thing. And to me, that stems from, like all these things, from childhood,
Yeah.
from my conditioning of the realization based on, doing the psychoanalysis and the shadow work. My dad never saying, I'm proud of you or you're good
Mm,
enough. So my
yeah.
whole life has been push yourself to prove to him that he should be proud of you, that you are good
Right.
enough. And,
Right.
and so I can't say it about myself. I can say it about my kids. I can say it about my wife. I can say it about my dog, but I can't look at myself. I can now because I've gone through the meditation practice and done the work. But I think a lot of us may, if we haven't done that work, if we don't realize that inner shadow and what's holding us back, we don't have the ability to actually see that we deserve the love, we deserve the safety, we deserve the wellness. That's what jumps out at me on that one.
Yeah. I love that. I think one of the things that happens, not always, but one of the things that happens is our voices as parents become the voices that are or are not, in our children's heads, when they grow up, right? So you never had that sense of your dad saying that he was proud of you. So that, didn't exist, right? Like inside of your head. And I remember over the holidays, this past Christmas, I was staying with a dear friend from college, and she has two kids. They're younger than mine, maybe, 5 and 2, and mine are 11 and 9. And I was saying to my children, and I'm conscious of this, but I didn't realize how much I was doing it, So I'd say, oh, good job getting ready and getting your shoes and your coat on. And, oh, I love how you wrapped that present. That's so pretty. And, oh, to maybe one of her kids, like, look how much you know about dinosaurs. Wow. Like, you've really put a lot of time in to studying this. That's so interesting. And she said to me, she said something to the effect of like, you can't stay here long because, my kids are going to get used to this like kind of praise. And, we don't do this in our household. And I said, well, that's, all well and good, but you have this moment in this time that you're raising your children where your voice, is or will become the voice that they hear in your heads when you're no longer with them physically or when you're no longer with them on this planet, right? So in this moment, you get to start to cultivate the things that they're hearing about themselves, the tapes that they'll play in their heads that will ultimately sustain them and be part of their guidance in the world. And I think that made sense to her. I think she started to think about this incredibly sort of beautiful and audacious responsibility that we have as parents to be the voice or a significant voice that exists in our children's head long after we're gone.
And it's so powerful that you say you have this moment, because I think of right now, my youngest turns 12 today. And so when we're done, I'm gonna go see him. He's back from his grandma's, and just ask him, what do you want to do tonight? How do you want to hang out for your birthday? I'm making a very conscious effort to recognize I have very few years left with these guys. I have to be that voice of praise and that voice of challenge and putting them in those situations to succeed and go through that uncertainty. And there's so little time for us to do it. So you really hit the nail on the head with that one, Taryn. Let's flip. So that was our internal connection. Let's talk about external connection. And I'll read a section that you wrote and let you color that in for the listeners, which was the critical importance of connection to others outside ourselves cultivates greater resilience as we draw strength from the support of others. Those who feel more connected to others have lower levels of anxiety and depression. They also have higher self esteem, greater empathy for others, and are more trusting and cooperative. Our external connectedness generates a positive feedback loop of social, emotional, and physical well being. Relationships aren't just protective. Lack of external connectedness predicts disease and death beyond traditional risk factors such as smoking, blood pressure, and physical activity. I mean, if that isn't mind blowing right there, I think also, correct me if I'm wrong, the longest study in the history of happiness indicates that the number one predictor of happiness as we age is connection to other people. And so, if connection is so important, why are we so much less connected as a society today than we have been in the past?
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened is there's a lot of stuff around, technical term, a lot of stuff, right? You know, I was born in the late 70s. Growing up, there was no email, there were no smartphones. We did not have internet in our home until my senior year of high school. And when we did, it was like a dial up connection. Papers were either handwritten, typed on the typewriter, or as time went on, written on a word processor. And so the stuff that we had in our field to distract us, it was television, could be like music or maybe a book. We all weren't like sort of walking around with these like
Yeah.
personal computers in our hands. And so now, if a couple, let's just say, wanted to really protect their connection, maybe they didn't put a television in their room back in the day, right? Now it's like iPads, telephones, television, you know, Alexa, just so many things that are happening in, computers in our lives. So I think it takes a lot of extra layers of consciousness and intentionality in order to connect deeply with one another. I only have to like walk through a restaurant. I'm out here in Las Vegas this week, as I mentioned, right? There's so many people that are sitting around a table and everyone has their phone in front of them, right? And there's a level of consciousness and intentionality that requires us to put that away and to truly connect with one another and to not get sort of drawn into that slippery slope of Instagram or answering this email or, things of that nature. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult to connect, in this 3D world because of all of those distractions.
Do you see that with children, especially as they start to get into their teen years? Do you see this only getting worse over time with this next generation and how prevalent the phone is or the iPad as part of their lives?
Yeah, I think, for me, it's about teaching our children a level of intentionality and consciousness, just as like I'm attempting to pursue in my own life. It's interesting. My boyfriend and I have talked about this. And when we first got together, he has these like Bose headphones. And I saw photos of him before we got together. And he often had the Bose headphones on his head, and when they weren't over his ears, they were kind of flipped up, on his head. And, we'd be having a conversation or something. And I'd say, would it be all right if you took the headphones off your head? Because it's just hard for me. Like I took the responsibility. It's hard for me to sort of feel connected to you or sort of like take you seriously with these headphones on your head, and he was like, sure. And it was interesting to see the progression in our relationship as we continued to become conscious about this stuff in our lives, because he was playing online poker every night, watching movies. If he was home, the TV was on, he had the headphones on, maybe he's doing something on his iPad, And when he moved in with me, I saw the headphones on and then they were up here, then they were around his neck. One of like my moments of like just incredible enthusiasm was like one day when he like couldn't find the headphones, like they'd been taken
Yeah,
off for
yeah.
such a long period of time. It's like he didn't know where they were. And what he realized was that television and online poker and movies and the phone and Clubhouse and all this stuff was an escape for him, was a way that he didn't have to be present in life. He didn't have to deal with hard things. He didn't have to look at some of the relationships that were happening. And when we got together and were very intentional about our connection with one another, those things started to fall away. And he even had this moment when when he first moved in with me, and he was like, I haven't watched television in like a month. He's like, I feel like, like my life is so dramatically changed. And it also created incredibly important shifts for him. He was watching television at night before he would go to bed, playing online poker, all hours. And then he would have trouble falling asleep because of the adrenaline of the game or
Of
because of the
course,
blue light or
yes.
both. And all of a sudden, when he stopped being hooked up to those electronics and when he started being more present in his life, he also started sleeping through the night.
It's amazing how much the little things add up, even if it's as simple as replacing that television with a few long walks, and your sleep is almost instant. You're out like a log just by going for an extra 6, 7, 8,000 steps in a day. I love that. And as we look away from connection and we start to shift to the idea of gratiosity, I loved how you blended gratitude with generosity to create gratiosity. So, can you share with our listeners what is gratiosity and why is it so powerful as part of our resistance formula?
Yeah, I think, we got to unpack this a little bit earlier, and I know we're coming up, toward the end of our time. So, gratiosity is really about this combination of looking on a challenge, a change, or a complexity with both a sense of gratitude and a sense of generosity. And I smooshed those two words together because they were really happening in tandem and part of this practice. So the gratitude part is about looking on that experience, even if we wouldn't have chosen it, that dyslexia, the ADHD, the PTSD, and saying, hey, I wouldn't have chosen that. And I can see the good in this. I can see how this has formed me. I can see the opportunities that have come of this. I can see how this how this sort of quote unquote negative challenge has made me into some very like positive aspects of who I am today. And then generosity is about drawing on our vulnerability and being willing to share our resilient stories generously in friendships, as parents with our children, as part of coaching, as part of mentorship within town halls and organizations. And being able to share these stories, it does two things. It solidifies our own resilience, right? It solidifies that identity and like what it was we did in those hard times that we didn't think or we may not have thought we were going to make it through. And then it also becomes part of someone else's survival guide. It lights the way for people that are on that difficult path. Whether we know it or not, there's someone that's hearing our resilient story and saying, you know what, because Clint did it, I think I can too.
Oh, beautiful. Let's stop the book conversation there. And do you have time for rapid fire 4 questions?
Okay, all right, rapid fire.
Let's do it.
Am I thinking about these, or is it just like,
It'll probably be pretty cool.
whatever comes to mind?
Yeah. What's one of the most influential books you've read for you?
Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
Oh, yeah. Wow, that resonates. What are you reading right now?
So many things. What did I just download? Oh, The Biggest Bluff by Kornikova. She's like a game theory researcher who became a professional poker player.
Oh, I love it. What's one thing that you have spent less than $1,000 on, let's say in the last year, that you've thought to yourself, wow, I wish I'd bought that sooner?
Lipstick that does not rub off.
Oh, that sounds magical.
$7
The
a tube.
application process is like 0. I love it. So because the show is about growth, what's one mindset shift, behavior change, or new habit that you've adopted in your life that had a massive impact for you?
I would say, I don't know that I've wholesale adopted this, but I'll call it divine timing. So my book has come out. I've, reached out to a lot of people and a lot of podcasts and a lot of news broadcasts, and a lot of people have said yes. And a lot of people just haven't responded. And that's okay. And so I've reached out to people a couple of times. And I think there's a sense, right? Like when we want to create something in our lives, like when is this going to happen? When are these people going to, reply to me? When am I going to have this? And I've adopted this idea of like divine timing, that, even if things aren't happening on the timeline that I hope or imagine or dream of, that there is a reason for that I'm not aware of. And if this is meant for me, I will continue to work to make it happen, and it will occur, but it will not be on my timing. It will be in divine timing.
It will be when it is. That is wonderful. And we went pretty wide, pretty deep. Is there anything we didn't hit from your book that you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I say in one of the last couple pages of the book, and it's about all of our inherent worthiness. And I find that so many of us grapple with worthiness, our own worthiness, aspects of our worthiness. And I talk about this concept that we are all both a masterpiece and a work in progress. And I think that's tremendously important. And I'd like to impart this to your listeners, to our listeners, to say, if we can think about ourselves and everyone else as in this moment, all being a masterpiece, right? We're divine and wonderful and special. And, there's no one else like us, and there never will be again. We are all a masterpiece in our own right. And just like any good masterpiece, those artists were never quite done. They were never quite satisfied, even if it was the Mona Lisa or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. They always wanted to just tweak one more thing, develop something over here, change something else, no matter how beautiful. And so I think when we get to think of ourselves as being inherently worthy, inherently valuable, that we are a masterpiece in this moment, and we will also continue to be a work in progress and change and grow and to continue to get better over time. I think that's a beautiful way that we get to be good enough in this moment and also pursue the goodness of growth and development over time.
And when you say it that way, we are a masterpiece, a work in progress, and best of all, we are also the artist. So it's just a wonderful way to approach your life. How can our listeners find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Taryn Marie. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. It's DR for doctor. At my website, resilience-leadership.com. We're actually doing a really cool thing right now. We have a meditation bundle. It's 5 meditations, 10 minutes each. Each of the meditations are based on one of the 5 practices, because we saw a really strong relationship between resilience and people that meditated, and people that meditated and are mindful have greater resilience, and people that are more resilient are more meditative and mindful. It's beautiful, like circular relationship. So we have this meditation bundle right now. We're giving the first one away for free on our website if you visit us there. And I'd be so excited to hear from you and also hear about the book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. You can grab that on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or download it from Audible. I read the book on Audible and just be delighted to have people experience that text as well.
Perfect. We will have all of that in the show notes. And thanks for joining me for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor to be your guest.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.